All right, we will go ahead and get started here. My name is Michael Daniel, and I am currently the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is a nonprofit information sharing organization for cybersecurity providers. I am also one of the co-chairs on the Ransomware Task Force. You've been getting a steady parade of us through here today. So this is the failure panel. By that, I mean we have heard from the disrupt folks about actually disrupting the adversaries. We've heard about deterring them before they actually take steps. We've heard about being better prepared so that, if they try to carry out something against you, it doesn't work. We're about to talk about what happens when all of that fails, right? Because inevitably, sometimes it will. And so how do we actually get better at responding to ransomware incidents when they happen? And so as we start off, I'll have each of the panelists, introduce themselves. But of the recommendations in the report, there were 11 recommendations that were associated with respond. We've seen some pretty good progress on about 2 of them. We've got 6 that have had at least a little bit of action and 3 that have really not seen much action at all. So we've clearly got a lot more work that we need to do here. But we've got a great mix of both government and private sector folks up here on the stage, some of whom have had experience at multiple levels of government and in both the public and private sector. So we bring a wealth of experience in actually responding to cyber incidents in general, but ransomware incidents in particular. So, I'm going to start with Eric. Eric, if you could introduce yourself. And the question for you is, what are some actions that the US government has taken to enable organizations to respond to ransomware events more effectively? Although your director just stole a lot of your thunder. But anyway, I'll let you try to say something new.
Okay, it's not that's happened. So I'm going to go through and have cybersecurity and CSM. I'll start just by nuancing Michael's opening, which is particularly when it comes to a ransomware intrusion, there are different shades of failure. And the worst case failure, definitely user error. Test. Is that better? Oh,
not user error. First time for that too. User error. All right. So refining Michael's opening a little bit, particularly when it comes to ransomware incidents, there are differing shades of failure. And the worst kind of failure, the reason, frankly, why we are all here, the reason why the task force was established, is the kind of failure that results in impacts to Americans' health and well-being, that results in impact to public health and safety, that results in hospitals diverting patients and critical functions not being delivered, 911 systems being degraded. That is the failure that we need to be ultimately focused on. And there's a lot of things that happen before that event occurs. And so I know our director, Jenny Shirley, just spoke a lot about our pre-ransomware notification efforts, but I want to abstract out the work that we are doing around pre-ransomware notifications, because the fact that we are able to do pre-ransomware notifications means that it is a known fact when an organization experiences a ransomware compromise, and there is a time period post-compromise between harm. And just to be extremely clear about the way that our pre-ransomware notifications work today, and I know Jen shared some of our remarkable stats, that work is entirely propelled by the heroic efforts of independent researchers doing this work on their own time. There is no reason, except perhaps for perceived barriers of contract or liability or trust, why almost every single ransomware intrusion can't be seen by some organization upstream and enabling a notification before harm occurs. And so, Michael, to your opening point, are we going to get to the point anytime in the near future where the number of initial intrusions gets to 0? Probably not. That's a very auspicious goal. Could we get to the point where the number of ransomware intrusions that result in an encryption event that yields harm to public health and safety? I say the answer is yes. But to do that, we have to really collectivize around this notion that there is a duty to warn, not just from the government, not just from the independent research, but every organization with visibility into actor activity, into actor targeting of US critical infrastructure has a duty to warn and a duty to notify. And that inflection in the model, that inflection in how we drive accountability to protect those who are most vulnerable, we've made a lot of progress there, but it is still a drop in the bucket. By making sure that we are collectivizing this work, we can make a much bigger impact.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I think one of the most interesting parts of all of this space is that, you know, almost every organization that we're talking about is when that we're talking about in this area, right, in the response area, what we can do better from the government side, from the private sector side, how we help that. The entities that are doing the response are also potential victims themselves, right? So it's kind of both at the same time. And I think nothing really exemplifies that more than like the state and local government situation, where both trying to assist, you know, their constituents, but also are like huge targets right now for ransomware actors. And Geoff, you've had a lot of experience at that. And, you know, what are some of the things that state and local governments are thinking about in the space, and how do they need to get better at doing response?
Is this on? Here?
Yep.
Okay, there we go. So thank you for the question, Michael. And before providing a response, I just want to also say thank you and congratulations for all the work of the Ransomware Task Force. It strikes me, and I came prepared with one quote only from Sir Edmund Hillary. It says, "People do not decide to become extraordinary, they decide to accomplish extraordinary things." So I think it's amazing when a group of people who are trying to accomplish something extraordinary on behalf of the citizens of this country come together. So congratulations on the effort. First, to introduce myself in a newer capacity, my name is Geoff Brown. I am at the full service incident response firm Arete. Oftentimes people ask me, what does Arete mean? Arete, in keeping with my comments about Sir Edmund Hillary, means the pursuit of excellence. So another thing that I think this whole room is all about. Now, speaking specifically to SLTT, I think some comments earlier today said this much better than I ever could. Comments from Nicole, comments from Craig, certainly comments from Director Easterly. And I would sum it all up as, in the local spaces, the rubber hits the road when you are serving the citizen. And in the response space, there are so many ways where local governments serve the citizen. In my time in New York City, we took both an administrative and technical approach. We looked at the policies that existed and we pushed the envelope on what we could implement technically. Some of you have heard me talk about the measure instituted under de Blasio administration in New York City called NYC Secure. That was an interesting capability to push the envelope of what could be done from a policy perspective to support something that was technical that could go into the hands of citizens. What I find interesting, to answer your question, is when it comes to state and local governments, there is both a push and a pull that can only happen when you have that direct connectivity. And that push and the pull happens because a citizen may be given into their hands a capability to better guard themselves. But then also on the flip side, when they need to respond, when they need help, what we want to do is give in the arms of those local governments that oftentimes don't have the capabilities, they do not have the knowledge. So when a citizen says, I am in trouble, the local government answers the phone and doesn't say, I'm not sure what to do, let me get back to you. And unfortunately, that is the state of many local governments when a small business or a citizen comes under a ransomware event. What we need to do through the leadership of individuals like Kiersten and Eric and through what DHS is doing and beyond is to give those responders the ability to say, I know what to do and I'm here to help. And that, I think, is a driving force in how state and locals both will improve their own abilities to respond and serve the citizen.
No, that's great. And sort of always having that in the back of, in your back pocket, the knowledge to, even if you aren't the right person, be able to get them to the right person. I mean, that's absolutely critical. And I think it's, very clear that in many cases, people are going to reach out to their local governments first before they ever think about going up to the national level. So I'm going to turn next to Sandra, no relation to the other Joyces, either Rob or Sean in the cybersecurity space. But Sandra, you've had just probably more experience than you really want in the, in the response space. And so coming at it from the private sector side, what advice would you have for policymakers who are trying to actually get the response processes better across the board?
Well, I think that to start, I think Director Easterly's comments made a lot of sense to me because in terms of vulnerabilities, so when a policymaker is trying to think about how to engage with citizens or how to create sustainable, durable legislation, just to think about the realities on the ground when they're doing that. I'll give you an example. So what Director Easterly's comments reminded me of was that in Q4, when we looked at about 60% of the incidents that we responded to, and respond to well over 1,300 every year, and the 60% of those were based on an initial intrusion that exploited a vulnerability, a known vulnerability. And so, yeah, when we think about legislation and policy, how can we account for some of these realities? How can we account for a shifting threat landscape where soon we will be in a situation, I believe, that with all these living off the land techniques and the shift to more aggressive tactics by threat actors and states that are doing things that are harder to attribute, it's going to make it harder, even more so, for defenders and for organizations that don't have, that level of skill and resource to respond. It's just simply not a fair fight, especially when we're thinking about things like that we've seen, Iranian, Chinese, and possibly Russian linked actors in our water as we speak here today. The municipalities and local governments that are actually defending in those areas, it is not a fair fight. These are not people who are resourced or skilled for that type of defense. And I think the last thing I would remind policymakers, and they need help, right? And so policymakers should also remember a very important thing, that when an organization is ransomed or there's extortion, it really is one of the worst days in that person's career. And I don't know that that's probably lost on people who are, looking at just from a policy perspective. And we're also seeing much more aggressive and brutal techniques like threats to family members, illicit pictures, threatening to send them to organizations. So the reality is it can be a very brutal place. It's not the moment to have 5, 6, 10 different legislative functions and reporting frameworks that we have to think about. How can we make it simple? How can we make it efficient and fit for purpose?
Yeah, and what I think is really interesting, Sandra, about what you just said there, that ties into a theme that we've heard across almost all the panels today, is this idea of leverage. Like when we're talking about disruption, where are the greatest points of leverage? Where are the greatest points that we could hit to have the most impact? When we're talking about deterrence, how do we spread that as far for the amount of effort that we have to put in? For preparedness, where is it that what are the actions that get you the furthest down the road? And now we're talking about in response, what are those things that we can do that have the greatest ability to help inform others, but that also impose the least amount of burden on somebody that's going through what you were saying is their worst day, right? And so this theme of leverage is one that I think we ought to take away from today about, we haven't on the defender side been doing as good a job at looking for those points of leverage and focusing on those, I think, as we could. And that's something the attackers do quite frequently. I think on the prepare panel, we heard a lot about the resources that are out there to help you prepare. But I think that's also true. There are a number of resources out there on the response side as well. And Kiersten, this is something in your space and both in and out of government that you spend a lot of time on. So can you talk a little bit about some of the resources that are out there for companies that are struggling to respond to a ransomware incident?
Sure. And a lot of this, we've talked about this issue for so long. And so we were talking outside how this is an evolution of preparedness, of response recovery, what we've learned about resilience. And so just starting from some of the basics about what's out there, we all know the value of tabletop exercises, right? And so when we look at these, it's understanding, what does a company have? What does it need? But what's fascinating is, I don't know, we're not Chatham House rules, but so there was an exercise that I was doing for a company a few years ago on ransomware. And when we went through the whole exercise, there were two things that came up. The first was the CEO said, one of our mission issues, one of our primary values is that we don't work with malicious actors. And so what that signaled to the whole team was, we're never going to pay a ransom. So what does that mean? So there was this fascinating cascading impact of how that addressed for the company what it was going to do. Similarly, I was doing another exercise in another sector, and there were all these lessons learned from the ransomware exercise that were never applied, right? So when we look at these pieces, the point as we're going through this is, how do we action what we know? And we see these in very broad terms. Eric said very passionately, if you ever think that you're bored about ransomware, you need to listen to Eric talk about the value of CISA and what we do and what CISA has done because of where impact lies. And it's about the people, right? When we think about cybersecurity, we often say, it's these technology solutions which are out there. But at the end of the day, it's who are the people that are investing in this. Craig talks about this so importantly, which is, what is our responsibility as individuals? And so whether you're part of a large corporation or a small business or a state and local government, it's the responsibility to understand what your role is and also how you're feeding into the broader piece about preparing and being more resilient. So from a corporation perspective, it's the value of exercises, understanding what the principles are. But for small and medium-sized businesses, for state and local governments, it's how are you connecting to the resources? One of the things that we launched through the great leadership of George Stathakopoulos from Apple at CISA was the Cyber 311 concept, which is essentially a hotline at the state and local level where you can pick up the phone and talk about what's happened to you, what are the issues, and then you're given solutions and given a way to address it. So it's both how do you prepare as a company, but where are your resources and who is on the front line? When Craig talks about this as cyber civil defense, one of the things that we really distilled during my time at CISA, thanks to the leadership of Jen and Eric and others, was what is the role of the people who are out there that have the expertise on the front lines to help and support, and creating those communities of knowledge and information sharing so that when we do know that there's a ransomware event out there, we're able to share the TTPs, we're able to understand it to prevent. But I have to go to something that Jen said, and I know has come up a lot, which is ransomware is a symptom of a much greater issue. And ransomware typically is not sophisticated, it's opportunistic. And where we then end up putting the responsibility for how to mitigate these impacts comes from the desire and the need to urge software manufacturers to really bake the security into the design process. We know this, we have to move the needle on this piece. And while we're doing that, while we're changing the culture, the importance of frontline knowledge and information sharing and preparing to be more resilient is how we get through this next phase of evolution as we're managing not just the ransomware issue, but all the threats that come after us when we are vulnerable because of opportunism, not because of sophistication.
Thank you. I think, you talked about evolution, Kiersten, and so we've actually got a really good example of the evolution of how the US government is approaching the cybersecurity in general, but ransomware in particular, because we actually have DOJ and DHS sitting next to each other on stage, right? And for anybody that's been involved in this for as long as I have, that's actually a big step forward. And it's a welcome one to actually see. So, Sonia, I'm going to give you a chance to talk about sort of, what victims should know about DOJ and FBI's response to cyber incidents, and sort of how does Justice Department fit in with what CISA does, particularly in the response space.
Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sonia Jimenez, and I work for the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice in the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Section, or CSIPs. As many of you probably know, we're not only involved in litigating cybercrime cases. In fact, my caseload is almost exclusively ransomware cases, but we're, of course, involved in policy issues. And I'm very happy to be sitting here next to Eric because we do have parallel missions in this space. And I think when people think about response, thinking about the reporting or the law enforcement component isn't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind as they are navigating these response issues. The difference between CISA and DOJ in the response world is that, of course, CISA is involved with asset protection, mitigating the impact of the event. And DOJ, through the FBI and the NCIJTF, the National Cyber Investigative Task Force, are responsible for threat response. We're conducting the law enforcement or national security investigation. We're looking at collecting evidence. We're looking at developing attribution or identifying opportunities to take steps to mitigate the immediate threat that's presented. And companies should be thinking about reporting in the same breath as they are thinking about response. For those companies that are in a position where they are following these recommendations that came from the Prepare panel that are conducting tabletop exercises, I would urge them to also consider reporting as part of that preparation, looking to establish a relationship with your local FBI field office in advance of the attack happening, and then take that contact information and keep it someplace other than on your computer system. Everybody wants an immediate return on their investment, and there is an immediate return in reporting to FBI because, as I think Brett Leatherman mentioned earlier, there is information that FBI has that they can provide related to what the company, the victim company, might see the threat actors doing in their network. How are they going to be moving through the network? What TTPs or IOCs might the company think? So you get an immediate return right there. But also, where do you think FBI is getting that information? In many instances, they're getting it because some victim before you has reported that information to FBI, and that information either directly led to something helpful for the victim under attack, or it was leveraged by FBI to develop information that was going to be helpful. I think developing a culture of reporting is something that benefits all of the victims, both in the immediate and in the long term. We've heard a lot today, for example, about the Lockbit disruption. And while I wasn't personally involved with that, I feel fairly confident that a lot of the information that led to the ability to carry out that operation came, at least in part, from victims who had reported and provided this information to law enforcement. Now, can I ever go to a particular company and say, hey, guess what? You didn't get victimized by Lockbit because we were able to disrupt their operations, and you don't know it, but if we hadn't disrupted them, you would have been the next victim that they targeted. Unfortunately, I'm never going to be able to go to a company and tell them that. But the fact is that those invisible benefits are out there, and they come about in part because we have information from victims. DOJ is very experienced, and FBI are very experienced in dealing with the concerns that victims have. Those are things that we can address with the victims as they arise. We are not only have laws that protect victims, but also policies that protect victims as well. And so these are not situations where we're blind to the concerns that victims may have about reporting, but we are a tool that can be available if a victim does report. And ultimately, we are a little bit dependent on each other in this space. We have to be. And so reporting benefits not only you, but also your fellow companies, who then, when they report, you benefit in turn.
Thank you. So now I want to turn to some of the recommendations that were in the original Ransomware Task Force report that we've reiterated in the latest progress report. And really, when you take a step back and you look at what we were recommending in the response space, it was really about how not only how do you enable companies to have a better response, but how do you enable them to not pay the ransom, right? And if we're, this is all part of going down this path of how do you lower the barriers to not paying, if you will. How do you make it so that companies don't want, because nobody wants to pay, right? They feel compelled to pay. They have some overriding reason why they pay. And so how do you change that calculus in a meaningful way? You heard Chris Krebs talk about the fact that, well, perhaps maybe you should not trust the criminals. That seems fairly obvious, but are there more explicit ways that you can take that into account? And so one of the recommendations in the Ransomware Task Force report was to actually, in fact, conduct a cost-benefit analysis before you make a ransomware payment. And my question is, for anybody who wants to respond, do you think many organizations make such an explicit analysis before they make a payment decision? And how could such an analysis actually help reduce payments?
I'm happy to start off. So hands down, the reason that victims pay most of the time is because they have looked at the potential disruption to their business operations and have calculated some financial benefit to getting back to business as soon as possible. Now, the comment by Chris Krebs is pretty valid. So one thing we do at Mandiant Intelligence is we do a lot of interesting work looking at these threat actors, because many of them are the usual suspects, and they continue to launch these ransomware campaigns through affiliates, across the world. And we know generally, we know generally which ones are likely to give you back your data or decrypt and set you on your way, but we also know that some of them are not legitimate. We can give that advice, but I doubt that your average defender in a company somewhere, almost half of which that we respond to are actually under 200 people. So I doubt that they're fully equipped to be able to have that type of knowledge for each individual affiliate or threat actor that they're dealing with. So there are a lot of components to this. And I would say that what we're asking organizations to do is go beyond the most immediate cost benefit, to not say, well, we need, we are a manufacturing business. For every minute we're offline, we lose, $500,000, right? That's a very real calculus being put up front. Can there be technology that allows for quick, return to operations? Is there another way that they can ease that piece? Because that's, in our experience, the reason they pay is to get back to business.
So like Sandra, in our response activities, we see victims conducting the activity that you asked about, Mike, too late. When they're in the heat of things, the precision of doing that cost benefit analysis, that battle damage assessment, they do it, and that is an inject to their calculation, but it's likely too late. With that said, I think one thing to the question of how we can do better from a response perspective is this notion of interoperability. Early on in my career, I was a simple staffer on the 9/11 Commission, and one of the big lessons of that effort was information sharing, breaking silos. And I think on the defender side for cybersecurity, the more we figure out how to be truly interoperable across the entire victim lifecycle, that will provide that victim with more optionality. What we often see is there is not just the detect, help contain. Perhaps in a firm like my own, we do threat actor communications, facilitation, but then you get to restore and recover. And the more that is a seamless set of opportunities for a victim to leverage, perhaps the better we can get them through that day without making that very difficult and terrible choice.
Any other, Kiersten, did you have anything?
I'll just offer that when we look at resilience, it's also about supply chain resilience. So I'll take it from the perspective of an entity that owns the supply chain. One of the things when we were running a nonprofit post the commission in 2016, but during COVID, was large companies that absolutely had their act together around resilience, multi-factor, all of these pieces, had not prepared for the small business in their supply chain that got shut down because of ransomware and what that did to the supply chain. So we've got to take care of the businesses, but then it's also, there's a responsibility on owners of supply chain to help with that. So I think the interoperability piece that Geoff mentions is really important. I'm also cautious of the industry that has been created around ransomware. So we look at companies that can do analysis on actors and talk about, if they offer this amount of money, will they bring it down? How many days do you have? that is an immediate response to deal with a problem. But again, we can't have that conversation without appreciating the fact that we are really addressing symptoms and that getting at the root cause of this is important. And it does evolve. And I know this is something that the task force has looked at. And I think it's really important, the role of insurance when we're looking at ransomware and how we're protecting, but also how we're inspiring the right environment for managing these types of threats and for resilience to get to where we want to go, to that point about minimizing payment. You know, there's always this theoretical discussion, should ransomware payments be illegal at some point, but we're certainly not there to protect the companies that actually need that protection. And so I think as we're looking at this, there are these pieces to look at resilience. Who has that opportunity to offer support and help supply chain owners, but also ensuring that we in the space that are working across this and leadership of companies like Mandy and what Sandra's doing at Google, it's very important that we're driving toward the environment and the reality that we want, not the one that manages the issue of the day.
Great. Any other? Okay. So we will be turning to the audience for questions. As Chris Painter would say, we're going to open the audience for questions so that you should get ready for that. Or I will also go down John Davis's path of dad jokes. I'm sure I can come up with some. The other half of oftentimes why companies pay, right, is they also feel like they don't have the resources to do the mitigation right, or the recovery, the actual recovery correctly. And so one of the things that the task force recommended was the creation of some incident response funds that could actually be used from the government to support companies, so that they didn't have to pay. But in the grant, and Congress has actually enacted these authorities, and that's great. And they even appropriated some money for it, and that's great. But they appropriated a very tiny amount of money in the grand scheme of things. It's like $20 million a year over the next 5 years, which, if you're tracking on the $7 trillion US budget, it's like 0.00002% or something like that, right? So, how should we be thinking about this ransomware incident response fund? How could it be used? How should we think about the resources that are actually required to do this right? So Eric, maybe I'll start with you since, your agency owns this fund.
Indeed.
And there are, and I'll let you talk about and Congress made it really hard to use, by the way. So.
As is often the case, Congress added some degree of complexity. So the Cyber Response and Recovery Act includes the Cyber Response and Recovery Fund, for those making a flow chart. Use of the fund, as designed in statute, has a few prerequisites, and the big ones. The first is that the Secretary of Homeland Security has to declare a significant cyber incident that has specific criteria for demonstrable impacts to national security, national public health and safety, and the like. The second, and actually in many ways the more important one, is that the victim organization requesting help has to make a showing, supported by CISA, that government resources are otherwise exhausted. So the only way to provide that assistance is through disbursement from the Cyber Response and Recovery Fund. To this point, Michael, as your question noted, there has not been an incident that was declared a significant cyber incident as per the Cyber Response and Recovery Act, nor has there been a victim request where CISA was able to say government resources are exhausted. So why is that? First of all, within CISA, we are doing a tremendous amount of work in exercising and tabletopping use of the Cyber Response and Recovery Fund, ensuring that the process to get a declaration by our secretary is well oiled, such that we are able to use the fund if and when the need arises. But really importantly, if we think about the process that would have to take place for a victim organization to come to the government and say, I need these specific resources to do this specific thing, such that CISA could then say, you know what, we've looked at what we can do, we've looked at our available resources, and you're right. We can't give you what you need, therefore, the fund is now available. That requires a really deep level of collaboration. And if we look at the ransomware landscape, the FBI has some great statistics showing that about 20% of ransomware incidents are ever reported to the government to begin with. And among those that are reported, the number that lead to a rich and robust conversation about what's really happening and what's needed for restoration is much smaller. Now, those conversations are happening, for example, with our partners in the third-party incident response firms, but by and large, they're not happening with the government. And so, a prerequisite for full-fledged, robust use of tools like the Cyber Response and Recovery Fund has to be that trust between the victim and the government to really have the honest and candid conversation about what went wrong and what does recovery and restoration look like. And it's too often the case with ransomware victims that they have likely perfectly reasonable concerns about legal risk and liability that forecloses that kind of robust collaboration, even if the incident is reported in the first instance. And so breaking down those trust barriers is going to be a key dependency to deploying more effective use of this fund that Congress created.
Great. And just Sandra, maybe I'll go to you next and then Geoff on sort of, okay, so what would it, from your perspective, like would some additional resources from the government help in this space? And, like, does it need to go to the extreme that Eric was talking about there?
Well, I think it's a very, generous fund. And I think fully, funding it in the, if there was a very, very significant cyber incident at the national level, it would definitely not be enough. I think that that's clear. But just thinking about from a practical application, it's definitely, Eric's point is very valid. Does this organization that requires these funds already know where their local DHS contact is? Do they know about the fund? Have they, are they willing to open their systems and books and make sure that, and by the time they're done doing that, is their business already in pieces because the ransomware event has cleaned them out? It's hard to say. So I think all good intentions, I think Eric's points and the challenges and complexities are perfectly valid for the realities on the ground.
So I think to a certain extent, as we examine any mechanism to assist a victim, it's important to think about the criteria whereby that victim qualifies for that assistance from the government, and acknowledging the absolute paramount importance of life safety and associated national security criticality. I have some concern based on the fact that these are not the companies, I think, that would perhaps be the first to think about reaching out. But with that said, I think we have an onus on us all as defenders and an onus on our relationship with the government to think about mechanisms that would provide for a more leverage, to your point, Michael, across the entire ecosystem. So we're not forced to choose between the value of one American business versus the value of another, no matter how big they are and how critical they are. I think we owe it to the work we have ahead to examine it more holistically than that.
Any other comments on this one? All right, well, I wanted to open it up to audience questions at this point. So if there are questions, I think I see one over there. So I'm going to make it as difficult for Taylor to get over there as possible.
Hello. Okay, great. So some of the worst attacks over the last few months, and certainly the ones I've responded to, have not been when things are encrypted, to a point where they can't operate. That's actually a really small minority of the cases today. It's when the companies have not been able to contain the threat actor through, I guess, like a normal show of force. So they literally have to pull the internet plug for a few days to get them out. This is kind of like the scattered spider thing again. Sorry to keep bringing them up. I guess my question is, have you found that you've been able to adapt containment approaches other than just turning the internet off to get these guys out? Or is that really the only surefire way to limit their dwell time? Because the ones I've seen, the threat actor has been able to stay in the network sometimes 3 or 4 weeks post detection, which is so anomalous compared to normal ransomware activity.
And I'll expand on that question too, which is, I also think in the length of time that it's been since we did the initial report, we've also, Sandra, I think to some of the points that we've talked about, what the actors are doing is changing, right? And sort of this is like emblematic, I think, of where the actual damage is coming from ransomware. So let's try to take some of that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think scattered spiders just aren't they the worst? They're the worst. So, just for those of you who are not tracking, they're a suspected North America, maybe UK-based organization with, when we say APT with them, it's advanced persistent teenagers. But the tactics are so brutal and irresponsible. And I know that seems odd to be talking about, a criminal and then telling them they're irresponsible. They go beyond the normal. So they're the ones who are, again, threatening responders. They're contacting their spouses. They are, in one case, we had a responder's wife be told all the ways he was going to kill her, right? And if they didn't pay. So it's not even ransomware anymore. It's not malware at all. It's extortion. And that's a very tough puzzle to solve, because when it's extortion, what you're talking about is, take the most critical pieces and of whatever service is being provided, or take the trust or support for in one other case, head of HR, whose intimate pictures are about to be released to the entire organization, right? And so these are just very brutal techniques. So I would say it's, we can talk offline maybe about some other techniques we found with them specifically. But I would say the thing that needs to happen is that these guys need to get put in jail, right? And somehow we need to figure out how is it that we know them by name, we know their techniques, we know so much about them, but they continue to elude our grasp. And that to me is the frustrating part. And I know that personally how many great professionals are working hard on this problem. But I don't need to tell anybody in this room how frustrating something like that can be.
Yeah, so I think one of the other changes that we've seen in the way that ransomware works, right? Sandra was alluding to this, of not only is a lot of the ransomware now really more about the extortion, like pay us or we'll release your data to the universe, pay us or we'll release, damaging facts about you, pay us or we will physically harm you. That starts to change the nature of this crime from being this. I think there were a lot of people that thought for a long time that ransomware is essentially a victimless crime, in the sense that it was mostly affecting companies who were big and had a lot of money, and so who really cared about them having to pay something. But now you're actually talking about, hospitals, businesses, school systems, other things, and threats of physical violence. And that very much changes the nature of how people think about this problem. But I think there's a question right here in the front. Right here. Yeah.
Thank you. This is Alvaro Atofa from Europol. My question is regarding the Cyber Recovery Fund, Response and Recovery Fund. I think that it's a very interesting approach, and I will follow up the question that was, or the statement that was made by Michael regarding that it was a really tiny amount of the government budget. And my question is it would be really helping if that amount would be really high, because maybe we could be giving the wrong message to the companies instead of get ready for what could happen to be able to recover yourself in case of an attack. So work on your business continuity. Instead, if we would be funding heavily this proposal, we could be sending the wrong messages, saying don't invest in this because the government will come to give you a hand. So is this the right direction, or how should we go in this line?
Yeah, and I think this is obviously the issue of moral hazard is something that comes up a lot in the insurance area and how we structure that. But Eric, I'll let you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a hypothetical version of a federal response and recovery, investment fund that could introduce moral hazard. That is not the fund or program that we have today. I think, that is why, presumably, why Congress set such a high bar for use of the fund. But certainly, we would not want to evolve into an era where we are disincentivizing investment by enterprises. But, I think to Sandra's well-taken point, many of the organizations that are victimized by ransomware and are unable to respond and recover effectively are actually not the ones who would reach that national level of impact. And so how do we help those victims more effectively? That is certainly an area where I think investment and consideration is warranted.
I think there's a question right here. And then somebody over there. So.
Hi, Jason Kikta, Senior Technical Advisor Adjunct at IST. So I was reading the proposed CERCIA reporting rules, and one thing that stood out to me was the intent to omit a lot of small businesses from a reporting requirement, right? Which makes sense. It would be, the thought is it would be onerous on them. But the reason it actually concerns me a bit is because, like the entire intent of the reporting, the added reporting requirement is to improve our visibility on this issue. And so if we omit them from our visibility, then we may inadvertently shape the problem down into the smaller businesses, into the schools, the hospitals, local governments. And so, I'm curious for the panel's thought on, how do we better shape our response processes to make sure that we don't just push this problem below the cybersecurity poverty line, and that we're really lifting all boats here.
So I'll just note at the outset. So of course, the CERCIA rule is out for open comment, and so I will not speak to the content of the proposed rule. What I will say more broadly is the goal of CERCIA is in many ways precisely, as you noted, to enable a flow of incident reporting that allows CISA to do rich analysis and information sharing that would contain the spread of campaigns and limit the ability of our adversaries to do such widespread targeting. And certainly we look forward to comments from the community on the proposed rule to ensure that we get that balance right.
Kiersten, did you want to expand as being, out of government now?
Well, I think it's important to note, what Eric's been talking about and what the Cybersecurity Division has done is really trying to balance all of these issues around education, getting out in the field. And this is the challenge, because we have to sequence a moment where we want to mitigate what's happening while also setting the stage for what's going down the road. And I think, if we think about where we were 3 years ago on all of this, there's been so much and progress that's been made both by government and by industry. Having said that, when we look at these issues, I don't think, to Eric's point, anybody's looking to not have these experiences. We were just talking outside that, there's a report that can tell you that ransomware payments have gone down. And there's also a report from an equally credible entity, that this happens where they've gone up. It's how we're getting this information. What we do know is that small businesses, state and local governments, schools at the local level are absolutely targets. And the challenge, to Sandra's earlier point and to a point that Eric made, is when that happens, they're not going to be thinking about any policy issue. They're going to be thinking about, how do I protect the people in my school? How do I protect whatever service I'm offering? So this just goes to the broader ability for state and local governments, for communities, for everybody, to the earlier point, to really have a role in understanding the reporting, knowing the community, and having the resources available. And whether that's through information sharing, to the point of, again, do you know your DHS point of contact? I think CISA has done a great job, again, under Eric's leadership, with what's happening at the regional level. That's a real step forward on the government saying, we are not just a federal institution sitting in Washington, D.C., but we're going to invest in the people on the ground to create those communities and create those abilities for information exchange. And so on the reporting piece, I think, we've got CERCIA, we'll see how that evolves and the rules and the input that's provided. But what we are seeing is this growing evolution of communities being created by government, with communities, with industry, with local governments and schools and institutions, to really help on the ground in the moment. And that's what we need right now. That's the urgent call to action for how we're going to address these issues in the moment.
Great. All right, Wendy, last question, and then we have a break.
Thanks. So, don't get me wrong, I'm all in favor of civic duty. I mean, I'm a boomer too. But throughout the whole day, I think a lot of the resources and solutions that we've been talking about are all predicated on the notion that I think may be uniquely American, which is that every organization is responsible for securing themselves. Every organization under 200 people and everything, it's like, back in the 50s, every family was supposed to dig their own bomb shelter. Is this really the right way for us to be addressing this? Because I don't think we even know, first of all, what constitutes effective security, and secondly, whether it's even affordable for the vast majority of organizations that are being hit, much less the citizens. And so, I'd really like to hear whether you think we have this all kind of back asswards. And that if we're going to come up with really effective solutions, it's got to be better than saying, okay, do, cyber hygiene, and then our response is going to be a $20 million here, have a toothbrush, sort of thing. Is there a way we can turn this around?
All right, since this is the last question, I'll start down there and we'll go a lightning round, back over this way. So Geoff.
Okay, lightning round. I think that's a fantastic question. I go back to one of my initial comments. We need to examine our policies in order to identify if they're fit to purpose and to apply leverage. Well, leverage will make the greatest difference. I think that's the spirit of what you're saying. I agree with it.
I think that we are doing everything we can from a resilience perspective, but at some point we need to find the origin of these people and organizations where they are not sitting in the United States, and we need to take care of them.
So I think hold it up near the top. Maybe there you go. There you go. I could start singing just like Jen. So I think there are two issues. I think that the responsibility and accountability of every individual to do their part doesn't actually depend on what we're doing from security and safety. Cyber civil defense, the empowerment of one, whether you're talking about whatever the issue is, whether it's cybersecurity, democracy, it's all about the power of one, the individual's responsibility. I think that's important regardless of what the issue is. So we do all have an accountability and responsibility to do our part. But to your point, I'll go to the fact, absolutely. So we've got to get the software manufacturers engaged so that this isn't an issue that falls on the shoulders of schools, of small businesses, of communities. If we are truly investing in security at the design phase, if we're truly making motions and movements on secure by design and creating secure and safe software and hardware from the beginning, many of these issues are mitigated. But again, that doesn't absolutely absolve anybody from, we all have a role. We have a role to educate, we have a role to be responsible, we have a role to share. But that doesn't preclude the need for software developers and manufacturers to invest in what we know to be the true case for the reality and the future that we're looking to build.
I'll reprise Jen's fireside a bit here, although I can't sing. We have created a culture in cybersecurity where enterprises are expected to systematically compensate for defective technology products. That works really well for mature enterprises that have multi-hundred person vulnerability management teams and control measurement organizations to ensure that those controls are not fragile and that they are patching faster, patching harder every single day. That systematically fails for smaller organizations that cannot manage that burden. And so, as articulated very nicely in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, we need to keep pushing on that shift in accountability to those entities that can bear it. And in the case of small enterprises, that is on the technology providers who need to be delivering services and products that are secure by design.
All right, Sonia.
All right. So I can, of course, only speak from the perspective of the work that we do at the department. And in large ways, we are reactionary to the events that happen. But what I can say is that victims are not alone when it comes to the department. We are a victim-centric organization, and we do what we can to not re-victimize victims. We also had in 2022, Deputy Attorney General Monaco said at the Munich Cybersecurity Conference that we would be shifting to include and focus on activities like disruptions, which do have benefits for victims, as we've seen time and again. And she said it, and we did it. And we've talked about several of them here. There are other events that we haven't talked about that are public. And of course, one of the difficulties in my job is sometimes there are things that are happening that we can't talk about, that aren't public or aren't public yet. And so it's always hard to bite your tongue when you know, when there are criticisms of what aren't being seen, but we are doing this to prevent victims from having to go through these events. So victims are not alone. And we are doing what we can to not only support them, but also to take the actions that hopefully will prevent them from being victimized again, or at least to bring justice to the people who are engaging in these activities.
Excellent. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion today.